Did Metallica sell out? Let's talk about it. So Metallica is one of those bands that has a reputation for having sold out at some point in their career, which means they traded their musical style or changed their musical style with the expressed point of gaining greater record sales without any concern for the musical direction other than gaining more fans and making more money. That is the definition of selling out. And for most people, the accusation that Metallica sold out is due to the enormous success of what's known as the Black Album, which they released in 1991. And on this album, there's a great departure from what they'd been doing before on the first four albums, which was a really strong kind of pure West Coast version of thrash metal. So for the purpose of this discussion, what I'd like to do is just talk about the first four albums, talk about the Black Album, and maybe dip a little bit into the catalog after the Black Album to decide whether or not there's a case to be made that Metallica sold out. Another aspect of the did they sell out question is the involvement that Lars had with Napster and online music trading way back in the 90s, where he was one of the first musical artists to stand up and say, hey, wait a minute, you can't just give away our music for free. What's going to happen to all the musicians? And then everyone got mad because they thought, well, he's putting money up above the music. And that is a separate issue from whether or not Metallica musically sold out in 1991 when they made the Black Album. Okay, so let's start by looking at Kill 'Em All, which is about as pure of a first album you can get from a metal band other than Black Sabbath, that they just went in there and tore it out in a couple of days. Kill 'Em All is not much more produced. It's not much more manipulated. It's just a pure statement of where the band was at the time, and it has a very strong garage feel. It has a very strong Dave Mustaine influence on it, and it tells you exactly what the band is. And it's not commercial. Let's get that right off the bat. There's nothing about the first album that could be considered commercial in any way. There's no ballads, there's no mid-tempos, there's no what you might call girl-friendly material. There's nothing on here that the radio would want to play. There's nothing on there that would be good for a MTV video. It's a straight up rock album. It's a straight up thrash album. On Ride the Lightning, they start to flesh out their sound a little bit. You've got a slight ballad with Fade to Black, and you've got an instrumental with the Call of Cthulhu, and there are still really strong thrash influences, but it's not as hard-hitting as the first album, so you already see a little bit of softening up, but I don't think that anybody in their right mind would consider this to be a selling out album. They were still on an independent label, they still retain their core sound, they still have a strong Dave Mustaine influence, and there's still a rawness to it all. It's not overproduced, it wasn't radio friendly, they weren't making a ton of videos for it, they weren't out there trying to be pretty boys and make a ton of money. They were still just totally expressing what the band was and exploring what they could do as an ensemble. Master of Puppets would be almost the culmination of the musical style that they were marching toward from the beginning. This first coalescence of their thrash sound, and interestingly enough, it has a lot to do with them pretty much shaking off the Dave Mustaine influence. Now I want to be real careful here. I'm not saying that he didn't have any influence on some of the riffs or some of the arrangements or some of the attitude on Master of Puppets. I'm saying that as Mustaine moved out of the picture, as Metallica moved on from his influence, they were already moving in a different direction, and it's more of a cinematic direction, it's more of a polished direction, it's more reflective. So the song itself, Master of Puppets, is unusual even in the history of metal at that point for its complexity and its intelligibility. Now, Priest had done a few things like this, and Sabbath had dabbled around in it, but Metallica was making this into an art. And there's another 8-minute track on the album called Disposable Heroes that's the same way. It's a combination of prog and thrash, and Orion is the same way. And then you've got something like Damage Incorporated, where there's a hardcore and punk and thrash influence, showing that they still have a ton of raw, aggressive energy. There's no suggestion whatsoever of a sellout, but there is a change in the musical style. Now, when we get to Injustice for All, they're recovering from the loss of a core band member, of a key pillar of their sound, and yet they continue to push on. They reflect this loss in the mix and in the compositions themselves, but they didn't abandon what they were starting to do on Master of Puppets. They just kept going along doing it. They kept experimenting with making thrash epics. And there's, again, the song One is a semi-ballad, and it had commercial properties to it, and the media and the machine, the marketing machine around Metallica tried to push it as a single and as a radio song, but that wasn't coming from the band, and that wasn't the intention of writing the song, and that wasn't the point of the song. So I would say on the first 4 albums, there's absolutely no hint of Metallica in any way trying to sell out. Their songs are getting longer, they're getting heavier, they're getting more complicated, they're getting deeper and deeper into the thrash genre, and they're creating statements that had not been done before. So they're quite an experimental band from the very beginning. Okay, so when we finally get to the Black Album, here's where everyone says that they sold out. And it's a complicated question because the album sold a ton of copies and it had a distinct change in direction. It was not the same as Injustice for All. It was not even in the same freaking ballpark as the previous thrash album. Songs like Sabbath True, The Unforgiven, Inner Sandman, Nothing Else Matters, they're all very commercial. They're all very polished. Now suddenly you have this great care and detailed production work and smoothed out vocals and melodies and backing vocals and all this overdubbing. Here's the thing though, it's not selling out, it's just moving on. They had just done a double album of the most hardcore, straight ahead, unembellished thrash music that any band has ever put out. It's a thrash metal physical graffiti type thing. They'd done just about everything you could do in that moment with that kind of sound. They have no real choice other than repeating themselves are doing basically what they did on the Black Album. So it wasn't a cash grab, it was just a continuation of the same experimental spirit the band had from the very beginning, only it moved into a direction that happened to be really compatible with, at the time, where videos and radio and the mainstream media was. So if they sold out, why wouldn't they continue this trend of making commercial music? Because they didn't. When you go to Load and Reload, they keep experimenting. They keep going with different types of styles and different types of approaches. And by the time you get to Death Magnetic, they've experimented their way right back to where they started. They're not trying to come back and be honest after they sold out. They just literally have gone through different musical journeys in order to recapture their enthusiasm and excitement for who they were when they started out. And if you look at it this way, what they're doing the entire time is just being an honest band. They're just being honest. So even if when they go off and do Metallica, that can't be possibly considered a cash grab. What are they trying to do? Make themselves respectable as avant-garde artists? No, they're just actually doing what they feel like doing in order to keep the band, vital and fresh. And interestingly enough, if you listen to them talk, that's what they say. They just may not be all that great at saying it. So when Lars addressed the question of betrayal and selling out, he said, well, there's a difference between selling out and not wanting to sound the same all the time. And when you listen to Kirk talk about it, he says the same thing. Well, we reached just about as far as we could go with what we had been doing, and we were looking for new ways to challenge ourselves so that we don't dry up and die. I don't know that I've ever heard James say it that clearly, but if you listen to his interviews over the years and you kind of look at him as a person and see what he's been doing, he's always looking for new ideas. He's always pushing himself, even as a person, to new experiences and new ideas and new ways of looking at things. So if you have people who are like that and they're extremely talented musicians, it's going to be impossible for them to do the same thing over and over and over and over and over again. You don't want them to do the same thing over and over and over again. So my feeling is, not only did Metallica not sell out, they were just looking for what they could do as a band, and it so happens that occasionally when they do that, it matches really well with where the popular mentality is, and they sell more records than they do at other times. That's not selling out. That is just being around for a long time and fully exhausting your potential as artists. On the other topic of Lars and the whole Napster thing, I think that's the main reason people think that Metallica sold out. If that hadn't happened, nobody would be, harping on them for being sellouts, because it was just a feeling that they betrayed the fans by putting money over the musical experience. But in retrospect, he may have had a point, because so many musicians are starving right now, and so many bands are just struggling to survive, that the loss of the music industry as it had been has changed things. And maybe it's too early to say whether or not it's for better or worse, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this matter. So if you have an idea on Metallica selling out, or on the music industry or the future of it, or how artists should be compensated, go ahead and leave a comment in the section below. Remember to like and subscribe. Thanks a lot.